Now my pleasure to introduce the next speaker of today, and this is Professor Shibli from Sheffield Hallam. He's Director of the Leisure Sport Industry Research Centre. And these guys do a lot of work, probably everything that you have read, a chance of everything you have read in terms of impacts and engagement of national sport federations in this country. The chance that the majority of this has been done by them. We're very grateful for all the work that they've been doing over the years to inform policies and other research. So we have specifically asked Simon to reflect on the work they do in terms of impact and the implications for NGVs. Without further ado, Simon Shibli.
Good afternoon, everyone. My time is running. 40 minutes is a limit, not a target. So once it starts beeping, I'll take myself off. I'm from the Sport Industry Research Centre, and we call ourselves CIRC. And in putting this presentation together, I feel as though I'm doing a kind of CIRC greatest hits. We've looked at research across a number of different impacts, a variety of events. And what I'd like to present to you this afternoon is a series of some of the highlights. So I wouldn't be an academic if I didn't start with some kind of conceptual framework for all of this. We're then going to look at 5 categories of impact, and then I'm going to finish up with some take-home messages. But as an initial take-home message, I can be a bit critical about some of the impacts which are claimed about events. And the first thing I would say is that events don't necessarily cause impacts. They are platforms or catalysts which can be used to lever impacts, but they in and of themselves do not cause those impacts. Nobody looking to shoot me down in flames at this point. It's very generous of you. If we'd been surrounded by commercial sponsors, I probably would have been. So let's have a look at some conceptual frameworks. And I'd like to pick up on what Vas said in his presentation. He used a couple of words which I was taken by: strategic intent. National governing bodies need to lever events to build capacity, and they have to use strategic intent. So Vas couldn't have set me up better for this, really, because we like to start with a strategic planning model. And I'm not going to go through this step by step, but the key point is this: that in order to lever an event, you need to have mission and objectives. What are you trying to achieve by staging this event? Because if you're not trying to achieve it, it won't be achieved by itself. How do you stop people committing crimes? Well, one less obvious explanation might be, let's get them playing table tennis. So how does sport work as a device or catalyst to bring about reductions in antisocial behaviour, improve teamwork and communication skills, and so on? So what it's about is trying to understand mechanisms by which impacts are achieved. Now, let's say we all agree that you need to have a mission and objectives, do some kind of corporate appraisal to find out what resources you've got, what you can realistically achieve, and then generate some options which you then put into practice. Now, for me, one of the best frameworks for events is the so-called balanced scorecard. Have a look at this here. So we've agreed we need aims in the middle, and events can be used to lever economic impacts and and with economic, I want to throw in environmental impacts. We can also achieve media and sponsor impacts, place marketing effects, and also sport development. And by sport development, I mean, yes, participation on the one hand, but I also mean elite sport development impacts. And it's these various kinds of aims that I want to take you through. So without further ado, let's get on to having a look at economic impacts. Now, I've interpreted the brief not necessarily as mega events, which tend to be the Olympic Games or the FIFA World Cup, but just international events in sport in general. And what we're going to see now is the studies that we've carried out recently since 2010 for UK sport, looking at the economic impact of various international World Championships, World Cup events, Champions Trophy, hockey type things, Rugby Women's World Cup and the like. And the first thing is, you can't see that very well. So what you've got is one big bar, which is a grand final of a triathlon event, which had an economic impact in London of about £7 million. And that clearly on that graph is an outlier. Everything else below it is from 2 million to 110,000 for a FINA diving World Cup. Now 110,000 economic impact is just a drop in the ocean. You know, Meadowhall shopping centre in Sheffield will take that in half an hour. Okay, that's barely noticeable. So the vast majority of international events that we stage have fairly modest economic impacts. I'm from Yorkshire. We had an event strategy once, and a major event was one which was defined as having an economic impact of £1 million or more. And in the Yorkshire region, we reckon there are 3. The World Snooker Championship, Test Match Cricket at Headingley, and the St Leger Festival of Racing at Doncaster. And that's about it for major events in Sheffield if you use that definition. What I want to do now is, I knew that Stuart Keller was coming and he's going to talk about cycling, is to look at the economic impact of cycling events. So in here, I've highlighted the cycling events. And I'm just going to come across here. So we've got the UCI World Championships, about 1.16 million. UCI Track Cycling World Cup, 1.1 million. Cycling World Cup again, 820,000. Down here to Supercross and BMX, 280,000, 210,000. Those are pretty modest amounts, but nonetheless, they still need to be managed. So when you get an event like the Tour de France, and you have an economic impact of 120 million, or what have you, that seems massive in comparison with these. But in the Yorkshire region, we've got an economy of 150 billion. So 120 million in the context of that is 0.06% of the entire economy. So yes, events have economic impacts, but let's not pretend that there's some kind of panacea for propping up the economy, because in the grand scheme of things, they are drops in the ocean. Welcome drops, but nonetheless, pretty much drops in the ocean. One of the things that we noticed with events is what are the drivers of them? What makes a big event in economic impact terms, and what makes a relatively small one? And we came up with this. Any event which is spectator-driven, like cricket, golf, athletics, the professional sports, these are the ones associated with relatively high economic impacts. But if an event is largely competitor-driven, like European short course swimming championships, or World Badminton Championships, junior boxing events. When the economic impact is being driven by those people who take part in the event, then the impacts tend to be relatively modest. There are differences for, say, mass participation events like the London Marathon, but generally for elite sport events, if the impact comes from those taking part in it, it will be a small economic impact. But on the positive note, what can NGVs learn from this? Well, one thing is, we've got so much data now, thanks to the UK sport largely, that we can actually forecast it with a reasonable degree of accuracy. What you're looking at there is the difference between the actual economic impact of events against a forecast. And you don't have to bother with the figures. All you need to do is to agree with me that the difference between here and here and there is pretty small. So just by doing a desktop study, using the data we've got, creating a model of what we think the event's going to look like, it is possible to get within about 80% accuracy as to what the economic impact will be. And because we are academics, for the most part, our forecasts were on the slightly modest side. We were forecasting less than the events were actually worth. So we can forecast it, and then most importantly, we can do some kind of return on investment. What's it worth? Well, this was something we did called Measuring Success 3. We looked at 6 events, and we looked at the funding from UK sport here, the economic impact, and what kind of leverage it achieved. So across the portfolio, for each pound of public investment, we were generating £3.20, which is not bad, but you see massive variations within it. So here, European eventing, equestrian event, retail village, lots of shopping, wealthy people, 16 to 1 return, whereas a relatively modest women's cycling event with an economic impact of 56,000 was generating 80p per pound invested. But across the portfolio, that's a decent return. Is it good or is it bad? Well, it depends on what you were doing, or aiming to achieve rather. In Australia, there's a rule of thumb. We won't touch an event unless there's a return of 8 to 1 on the investment in some areas. So using that as a criteria, that's a good event. The rest of them aren't in Australia. Good events over here. And then when you really ramp it up, this is one of our favourite events. This is the Open Golf Championship. And the last time it was held at St Andrews in 2010. Golf Open delivers £100 million economic benefit to Scotland. Well, yes it did, but you could scrape the figures, scrape the surface of the figures and look more critically. Around 45 million of that was actual economic impact, cash flowing into the host economy. The remaining 55 billion was the notional value of the television coverage portraying Scotland in a positive light globally. So taking the two and adding them together is like taking an apple and a banana and making a pear. You know, cash is cash, advertising value equivalent is a notional figure. It really shouldn't be added together, but this is what the media does. And if it gets repeated twice, it becomes a fact. And a fact you can't back away from sometimes. So key messages on economic impact then. A major sport event doesn't necessarily mean major in economic impact terms. That diving event, it's 110,000 economic impact. It was a major event in diving, but it wasn't a major event in economic impact terms. The key thing for national governing bodies is, well, whose responsibility is it? We've got enough of a job trying to stage the event in the first place. Whose job is it to make sure the economic impact is maximised? And I'd say this is where you need to be working in partnership with, particularly with local authorities, who have a vested interest in stimulating economic growth in their host economy. How do we minimise leakages? Money leaving the economy, how much we pay in property rights, how much we pay to contractors based outside the host economy, and then how do we maximise the inflows. Can we use local labour? Can we use local caterers? Quite often you'll see events and they'll use partners who are based outside the host economy, so the economic activity with them doesn't impact positively locally. So money changes hands, but not in the local economy. So those are the key messages on economic impact. We now need to have a look at what we call the environmental impact, but the dark side. That's a nice environmental picture, but let's have a look at this. This was some work that we did for the rugby, the Junior World Cup in rugby a few years ago. And what we're looking at is carbon consumption. So the only thing that matters on here is for people travelling from the UK, their carbon consumption was 8 kilograms on travel and just under 17 in total. But because rugby is very popular in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, bringing players and families and spectators over, their carbon consumption, 497 kilograms in travel and just over 500 in total. So you often hear about this event is carbon neutral. No, it isn't, and it never will be. There may be aspects of the event which are carbon neutral, but the travelling of spectators and their consumption means it's very, very difficult. Now, what I'm going to show you now is the travel for the Open Golf Championship last year in Hoylake. See this little hotspot on the coast there? That's Hoylake Golf Club. We're in Liverpool. Each one of these dots is somebody who bought a ticket. And what we can say here is that the Open Golf Championship attracted at least one spectator from every local authority district across the UK and a lot of people from beyond. So just think about the travel involved in getting to that event and how much carbon gets consumed. So environmental impact is, if you like, the dark side of economic impact. That when we consume things, remember we're trying to stimulate economic impact, we're encouraging people to consume. So consumption consumes carbon. High economic impact equals high CO2 emissions. Now, our colleagues in Cardiff did some work at the Millennium Stadium looking at the FA Cup final and Six Nations matches. And what they found was that people attending these events, by the time they travelled to the venue, had some beers, food, souvenirs, meals out and so on, consumed 6 times as much carbon as they would have done had they been what they're doing normally, had they done what they were doing normally on a Saturday. So it's a massive increase in consumption to take part in events. We can mitigate these effects. Some people do things like park and ride facility to avoid congestion in city centres, but we can't offset them completely, and it would be something of a myth. Cycling might have a different view on it, because you can maybe offset some, but generally with events it's very difficult to entirely offset those things. Let's take a look now at media coverage. And I want to start with the first ever event in the UK that we looked at the media coverage on, which was the 1998 European Short Course Swimming Championships. They were held in Sheffield. And in the UK, it was featured in 6 programmes here. 369 minutes, which is just over 6 hours worth of coverage, to a cumulative audience of nearly 5.5 million. So at the time, roughly 10% of the UK population. And it achieved a TVR, a television rating of 4.9%, which means that at any point in time, or that point in time, 4.9% of the entire population were watching the short course swimming. What they were actually doing was watching grandstand and waiting for the football results to come through. But that doesn't matter, you know, and they were watching swimming and the results were coming through slowly but surely. There was other coverage in Europe. We got a cumulative audience of 2.5 million, but in Finland, where it must have been dark and there was nothing to do, they achieved a TVR. 9% of the Finnish population watched some segment of the European Short Course Swimming Championships, which is quite some reach. I mean, this was like amazing stuff at the time for the ASA, but no idea that their product could reach such huge potential. So if we look at the grandstand data then, this is, you know, we don't have grandstand anymore, it's a long time ago. It was a very quaint time.
Showing your age, Sam.
We had sport on TV on a Saturday afternoon. But what you can see, this is the swimming here with an audience of 2.2 million. As we get, this is just before 3 o'clock, so football matches are kicking off, and as was the policy at the time, they used to update the television coverage when goals went in the various matches. So we're about 3 o'clock here, matches kick off, people start tuning in, and the audience gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then we're at 4:10 here, this is about start of the second half, or well into the second half, and it peaks at 4.9 million. And then when people are watching the final score of the results, it got 7.9 million. So you can see that this sport programme was a considerable catalyst for generating an audience to see swimming. And of course, what that means is that there is a property right or a value attached to that, which we'll come on to shortly. Being parochial still in Sheffield, we did some work on the snooker championship, the World Snooker Championship, which gets 100 hours of terrestrial coverage on the BBC every year. So what's that worth to the Crucible Theatre where it's staged? What's that worth to Sheffield? Well, there were 493 verbal mentions of the Crucible, and the value of those mentions was just over $250,000. These things here we call postcards. They're sort of little vignettes, human interest stories about Sheffield. So a snooker player goes to a Sheffield pub or nightclub, or a snooker player drives his sports car into the Peak District. Positive images of Sheffield. It's about 1.5% of the coverage, and these postcards for the Crucible, £343,000 worth, a little bit for Sheffield. And so what we've got is a total media value of television coverage of 3.2 million across this 100 hours of coverage for Sheffield. And what I want to do now is to put this into perspective by saying, well, how does it compare with the economic impact? So here we've got the economic impact. We've done this study, must have done this study 6 or 7 times. Every time it comes out the same figure, 2.25 to 2.5 million, 18,000 bed nights. So we get this inflow of cash, 2.25 million. Plus, we get over 3 billion in media value for Sheffield and the Crucible. So if you want to add the two together, then it's an economic benefit rather than impact of just under 5.5 million every year for 40 years for free. Except now we have to pay a bit because they know what it's worth. In a way, Sheffield was hoisted by our petard in the sense that we did this study. They then got a sense of, oh, this is what it's worth now, so now we need £300,000 a year to keep this event in Sheffield. But compared with that economic benefit, it's still worth it. It's money well spent. I just want to make the point now that all publicity is not necessarily good publicity. We asked people about their perceptions of Sheffield. And the top 3 that come out, obviously at the snooker, would be the snooker at 71%, steel and cutlery, no surprise there, and football. But then what we did was to compare, this is what people in Sheffield think, this is what people elsewhere think, and red is hot, people elsewhere think this more than Sheffield, blue is cold, Sheffielders think this more than people from outside. we'd had the benefit, if you like, of the Full Monty, which was a film about male strippers. And people in Sheffield associated it 5.6%, but elsewhere 9%. But the index of that, the index score was 161, so they're 1.6 times more likely to think that than other people. Now that's not really the kind of image that you're trying to portray through staging major events or having films. By contrast, on the cold side, we're very proud to have two universities in Sheffield, one of which is the Russell Group, and the other one which is ours. But nonetheless, people didn't associate that with the town. And then probably the most important asset we've got from a tourism point of view is the Peak District. And you've got 6%-ish here and less than 1.5% from outsiders. So the message that you're trying to get across is actually quite important, and it doesn't necessarily follow that all publicity is good publicity. I want to do a quick case study now on the Rico Women's Golf Open, which we've worked on. Women's golf event, probably the most prestigious one in the UK calendar. Global audience of 8.9 million, 2.2 in the UK. 1,025 hours of real broadcast coverage across the globe. And for Rico, the sponsors, 11.9 million in media value. So they can sit there and think, well, okay, we put, 500,000, a million into this event, we're getting 11 million back. That's a pretty good investment. And it's gone up 54% since we did this event last year. But not everyone's a winner. Rico are up here, 11 million these two combined. For other people down here, the Ticket Factory, that's $7,700. Scotland, the home of golf, probably put stacks of public money into it, $40,000 return. IMG, who owned the company who did this research, $71,000. So, it varies very, very much. And I'll show you why. Let's look for Rico. Everywhere you look in these screenshots, Rico branding, there, here, on the clothing, trophy, over here. So the point I'm trying to make is that all of these things have a property right. And there are people who really know what they're doing, how to lever the maximum value from an event. And they'll sell branding on everything. They employ people to make sure that these are at the right angle and to assess the coverage at the end of every day to make sure they're facing in the right direction, the camera's in the right places, and so on. Same again here. There in the corner, on the bib, the flags, tee-off points. Very subtly placed bit of branding here on the green course, here on the grandstand. All of these things have a value, and all of these things get sold. So the key message is that the media coverage is measurable, and it has a quantifiable value. Which therefore means TV coverage, through an NGB, has a property right attached to it. And obviously the value of that right depends on how many viewers there are and how much exposure you achieve for that property right. Now, social impacts. What we're going to focus on mainly here is the inspirational impact of major sports events. So I'm going to hit you with a little bit of theory now, again. This is something that we use to help conceptualize how people might get into sport. So let's say you're sedentary and you're not interested in sport. You're here, you're a pre-contemplator, not even thinking about it. And we need to move people, we need to change their attitudes so that they at least contemplate, they're thinking about becoming more active. So it might be attending a major sports event, watching something on television. attending a coaching session or a taster session. And then they think, yeah, I could probably get into this. So they do some preparation. It might be going down the gym and having an induction session or a look around. It might be they go out and buy some kit. You can't play sport without kit. And then they do something about it. They start participating. And when we've cracked it, we hit the maintenance phase, which is it's now a part of their life and they just do it routinely. So what we're interested in our inspiration research is trying to say, well, where might people be in this kind of model? So my first question is, do events inspire people to want to do sport? And the answer is yes. This is 9 events that we looked at. You're interested in the green bars here. 57% on average said, I agree that as a result of attending this event, I am motivated to do sport more often than I do currently. It varies by event. This is a triathlon event, 76% inspiration effect. Why? We don't know, but probably because it got a mass participation element. By contrast, figure skating here and BMX, 44-45%, well below the average. Just to put this into context, UK Sport have done some of their own research on this, and if you ask the same question when people have watched sport on television, you'll get an answer of something like 20 to 25%. So clearly, attending live sport events has a greater inspiration effect than watching TV. But, and it's a big but, who is inspired? Well, this is by age here. So young people, 16 to 24, 45 plus. The inspiration effect decreases with age. We're not saying you can't teach old dogs new tricks, but you can't teach old dogs new tricks as well as you can young dogs. Or words to that effect. Who else is inspired? This is how much activity you do. So 0 days, sedentary, 1 to 11 days, active but not enough, and 12 days plus, model citizens. This one goes up like that. So the more active you are, the more inspired you are, which is a bit of a problem because it's these people, the 0-dayers, who we're trying to get hold of. So what kind of increases do we get? I explained this briefly. We then followed up people who said they were inspired 12 months later to say, well, has this inspiration turned into actual behaviour change? So we monitored, did you do more participation in the 3 months afterwards? Did you do some in the 3 months afterwards and it sustained when we interviewed you 12 months later? Not in the 3 months afterwards, but at some point thereafter. In the 3 months following the event, or at the time of the follow-up survey, so that's any increase, and the longitudinal increase at the time of the follow-up survey. Let's not get too bogged down with these. The basic points are these. If you're already active, compared with the inactive, all of these scores for an increase were much higher for those people who are already active. 35 v 26, 36 v 24. So in a way, we're trying to do missionary work, and all we're doing is preaching to the converted. Does the inspiration effect work? Well, it would appear to, because these are people who had some inspiration, said they had, and these are the people who are not inspired. And again, all you need to note is that those who were inspired on all of these indicators had much higher scores than those who were not inspired. So it would appear that there's at least a tangential argument to say that the inspiration did in part cause the behaviour change. But attribution is difficult. Now what I want to show you is something that's happening in England here. This is what we call the 3 by 30 indicator, measured by a national survey called Active People, and 25% do 3 bouts of 30 minutes activity per week. And you can see it's kind of shot up there during the Olympics, or around that time of the Olympics. This is the 1 by 30 indicator, which is relatively static by comparison. If we standardize these and say, well, let's take this as 100, or the start as 100, and measure it as a base of 100, as an index, we get this. That's the 3 by 30, massive spike in the run-up to and during the Olympics, slight tailing off. And this is the 1 by 30 indicator. It peaked here, which unfortunately we took as the baseline, tailed off, picked up a bit, tailed off. So if we'd stuck to our guns and said 3 by 30 is our target, we'd have nailed it, but we went with that one. So, a little bit more theory. What we're trying to do, and this is the Ansoff matrix, we're trying to get new customers, new markets for existing products. This is what we call market development. This is the holy grail of sports development. What we tend to achieve is this, market penetration. Existing customers making more intense use of existing products. So people cycling more frequently. So key messages then. Events can inspire people. The inspiration effect varies. Sadly, it's highest amongst the active. It's difficult to attribute causality. And in the interest of time, there are other social impacts, like enjoyment and quality of life, but we haven't got time to deal with that. What I deal with now is elite sport impacts. She trained at Sheffield Hallam University, Brazil's first ever female judo gold medalist. So what are the advantages of host nation effect? And Irina said something which really struck a nerve with me. The host nation effect, Russia got out of control. So how does it work? Concessionary qualifying, you get more places in the games anyway. Familiarity, now this is the story, isn't it? Whistler, Canadian athletes, 300 goes down the sliding track, every other country 30. Who won the medals? Canada. So familiarity with the facilities. Lack of disorientation, being in your own time zone, in your own bed, your own water, your own food, and so on. Home crowds, particularly in subjectively scored events. What do you get out of it? Athletes get experience from being exposed to international competition. Your volunteers and your officials also get experience. And you can also get involved in improving your international influence. We have something like 170 plus people on international governing bodies now, which is more or less doubled since we started taking this seriously before the Sydney Olympics. So a massive impact. I want to indulge myself with the Olympic Games now. This is something I do know a little about, which is the host impact. So this is the increase in gold medals won, increase in total medals won for every one of the last 6 or 7 hosts. They've all increased gold medals won, and apart from the USA, they've all increased total medals won. So Brazil, we expect to see you somewhere around about here. And because we've got some Russian guests, we can do this for the Sochi Olympics too. And here we can see Russia was the most improved host in terms of gold medals won, with an increase in 10. But the general pattern is the same, gold medals increasing and total medals also tending to increase. So key message then, there is a host nation effect, but the causes are various. Could be judges, egged on by the crowd. Could be we've hogged the slide and you guys aren't having a go. So the effect varies by event. And so the events don't cause host nation effect, they are catalysts for them. I think that's one of the themes of what I've been saying. Now, I've got to play by my own rules here. Take home messages, events are opportunities, because they don't cause impacts. You can use them to lever impacts. As Vass says, strategic intent, impact should be planned for, resourced, and and then optimized. But NGBs can't do this on their own. It has to be done in partnership. Measurement and attribution is difficult, despite the claims that are made for them. And if you're dealing with something like a diving event that has an economic impact of £110,000, you've got to have a sense of proportion. Why waste money evaluating that? Why think that's going to change the world? It won't. You've got to have some kind of sense of proportionality. So that's been a whirlwind trip around the Cirque highlights. Hope you've enjoyed it. And if you've got time for any questions, I'd be more than happy to take them.
Thank you, Simon.
14 seconds over, sorry.
Wow.
Oh, failed.
Well, there.
Russian word.
Any questions from the floor, please? James.
Thanks, Simon. I found that very interesting. A lot of the research now is saying that the real outcomes from mega events are social impacts, not necessarily the economic impacts.
Yeah.
Do you have comment on that? And is there a way that is actually used to measure social outcomes or social impacts?
Oh, that's a fantastic question, which allows me to plug shamelessly eventimpact.com. So, taking the first part of the question, the shift from economic impact to social impact is probably a realization now that we've done economic impact to death. And we know what we're doing. We can pretty much model reasonably accurately what the economic impact of events is. And we've kind of matured as well. And organisations like UK Sport, who in the early days were accounting for public money by saying, well, yes, we spent this on the event and it generated this much economic impact. Now we're saying we can take a partnership approach and we can be a bit more subtle. So one of the things that's been really good about this has been the working together with UK Sport and Sport England to create, I think it's about a £3 million activation fund, whereby the funding from UK Sport funds the event, that drives the inspiration, and then Sport England and the NGBs, it funds, then pick up on that inspiration and try and lever it into participation. So it's been a journey from fairly simple stuff like economic impact to a much more subtle one about we're trying to improve people's lives, we're trying to hit the participation agenda, we're trying to work in partnership. And increased participation is one kind of social impact. You know, wider regional development agencies and local authorities put money into things. They want two things. One, they want to increase local GDP, and they want to improve the quality of people's lives. And sport events uniquely enable you to do that. So I think that's where it's at, and for us I think it's a nice place to be. And we're kind of moving away from the big events and able-bodied type events to now looking at Paralympic events and seeing what kind of subtle nuances we can get out of those in terms of social impacts. So it's a good place to be. It's like being paid to do your hobby.
Just make it one bridging the participation and the kind of elite and the economic element. And certainly recently in British cycling, we think about major events cultivating a fan base. So 8 years ago, there wasn't much of a fan base of cycling, but with the exposure and the different ways you can stream the events now and get more eyeballs on it, we do think there's a lot in this about cultivating a new fan base. Do you have any thoughts on that?
We agree with you, and more tangible evidence is the recent Tour de Yorkshire, where this time last year we were hosting the Grand Départ for the Tour de France, and people said they'd be turning out in their millions. I was very sceptical, but when you see the footage, probably not a million miles away. If it wasn't millions, it was certainly hundreds of thousands on each day. And as a legacy, we have the Tour de Yorkshire, and we see the bunting out, we see people out on the roads. I think since the Tour de France in 2007, the Olympic success in the interim, Wiggins and Froome in the Tour de France, hosting the Tour de France over here, something's happened. And it's quite interesting that in terms of participation, that participation levels overall have remained flattish, i.e. they're not increasing. cycling has increased. So there's an argument to say that cycling may have cannibalized other sports. People say that maybe I don't fancy swimming so much, I'll do cycling. So if something's worked, then yeah, we're noticing a fan base. And I think when we look at footage of events, the crowds were a lot bigger than the pitiful crowds we saw in the 2004 Tour of Britain when it came back after a 5-year lull. So yeah, agree.
If you don't mind, we're getting some questions through Twitter, and I just would like to ask Sam one of them, read out one of them. You talk highlighted that the research is there, but how do we ensure politicians, organisers are guided by evidence-based policy?
That's a really good question, because we are kind of objective rationalists, and we'll call it as we see it. But more often than not, particularly for politicians, rather than evidence-led policy, you get policy-led evidence. And just remember, we're streaming to the entire world here.
This was a question from a person from the United States.
Right. So it's very difficult, and the United States is a brilliant example, whereby on the one hand, you want to relocate an NFL franchise to a particular city. The people who are all for it, like the mayor, they'll say, yeah, that's going to bring in billions of pounds in economic impact for the duration of the franchise. And then somebody from the university will say, no, that's going to cost you money. So which one do you go with? And it tends to be who's got the power, who's got the money, who's got the vanity. It tends to be the politicians.
Okay.
Yeah, sort of a couple of linked questions really. I just wondered if there was a correlation, positive or negative, between economic impact and inspirational impact. And then secondly, whether you're seeing through some of the research you're doing with UK sport, distance that spectators are prepared to travel when they're doing a few hours a week of activity versus all a month versus more.
Well, the first question is a really interesting one. Is there a correlation between the economic impact and the inspirational impact? And you're lucky we're sitting on the table with two experts there who will no doubt be answering this question and sending a response by email at some point. But in terms of the inspirational impact, what we saw with the 9 events is that it tends to be very context sensitive. So why was the triathlon so high? Probably because it was also a mass participation event. The spectators were the friends and family of those people who were taking part. So you've got 5,000 ordinary members of the public taking on a very significant physical challenge in Hyde Park. And, you know, it's quite an emotional thing. And maybe that led to heightened inspiration. Whether it is any way linked to the economic impact, I don't know. But it's an interesting one to go back and ponder. It won't be too difficult to line the two sets of figures up and come up with a correlation. In terms of distance travel, you mean distance travel to the event or distance travel to sport?
To the event.
To the event. I think the further people travel to the event is probably a sign of their commitment. And if they're committed to that, then they may well show the same commitment to other things. We do have postcode data, so it wouldn't be difficult to do that calculation on some of the work that we're doing this summer for UK Sport, whereby if we've got an individual's postcode, we can calculate the distance between the postcode and the venue, put it into bands, and then cross-tabulate that against either the inspiration effect or the extent to which they're active. So in short, thank you for two great potential research questions. If you've got any money to fund it, that would be better.
And well, on that note, I'm afraid we have to finish this fascinating discussion because we have to move on with the next presentation. Simon, thank you very much indeed.